Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. My name is Adi, and today we have another special guest. We have a player who got top 12 in the North American Players Cup. Please welcome Ethan Mattos. Ethan, how are you doing?
Hey, Adi, thanks for having me on the channel. Doing pretty well. Can't really complain. So, just glad to be here.
I'm happy to have you on. And for those who may not know about you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so probably most people have not heard about me unless they've seen my name on the in-game ladder somewhere. But I've been playing Pokemon since the beginning, and really recently got into more of the competitive scene. I think with quarantine, I had reconnected with one of my fraternity brothers who was really into Pokemon once Sword and Shield came out. And he said, "Hey, why don't we team build? Why don't we battle a bit?" And I just found. Sort of getting back in with Sword and Shields, it's been really easy for, I think, competitive players and for people who are a little bit newer to the VGC scene to get back in with all of the sort of quality of life improvements that they did. So since the beginning of sort of Sword and Shield Online, I've just been doing sort of the in-game ladder, the casual tournaments that they have on Showdown and everything. And then obviously this sort of past month with the Players Cup qualifiers and then the actual tournament itself, I sort of got back into the team building competitive scene. So after this, I would say making it into the Players Cup itself is sort of lit a spark for me to, I think, participate in a little bit more of the grassroots tournaments and of course any of the official tournaments that are coming up in the future.
Yeah, definitely. So, did you go to any of the early season regionals that we had before the circuit got canceled, or Players Cup 1 or 2?
I wish, but I just did not have the money to travel, unfortunately. And it was something that when I was in school still, I was very interested in, but never really got the opportunity to. So hopefully, once everyone's vaccinated and we get a little bit back to normal, I'll definitely be showing up at several of the events. And so I'm very excited to sort of join the in-person community as well.
Yeah, definitely. This has been having this long pause in the circuit has been really interesting because we've seen so many players come out of nowhere and establish themselves as after doing really well in a lot of these online tournaments, be it Players Cup or some of the grassroots tournaments. And so I'm really excited to see everyone in person and kind of see how the scene shakes up once we get real life events back. And yeah, hopefully I can see you there and we can play each other at one of those.
Yeah, that'd be very, very exciting. And I think it's been fun with online playing some of the big streamers and content creators, but I think like the atmosphere of an in-person event sounds really appealing. So that'd be great.
Oh yeah. I'm sure you're gonna love it. But let's move on to the team that you used in Players Cup. So this is the team that you used, and can you talk me through a little bit about the team building process and how you got to this team from the start of Series 8?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, after the sort of the online qualifiers, which, as everyone knows, were played in Series 7 rules, I believe, I actually didn't play at all. Once we moved into a little bit of a restricted format, I just kind of fell out of it. I felt that I'm not very good at team building with restricted. I thought everything's too powerful. And to be honest, my normal sort of style of play, I would say, is a little bit more slower, bulkier, reactive. As you can, I think, see in the final team, I was able to eventually reach something like that. But the very beginning, I just got sort of tilted out of Series 8 because I was like, man, nothing I'm doing is working at all. And so sort of going in, realizing that I actually had qualified to play in the Players Cup, I was like, oh crap, I need to figure out what exactly to do and sort of what's good in the metagame. And so I went through just a lot of different variations. Sort of to begin with, I thought, well, everything with restricteds, it seems it's focusing towards a little bit more of a hyper offensive tilt, right? You want to get that big damage off immediately. You want to get these Pokemon that get ramped up really quickly. So as you can see, I think I sort of started with some of these more hyper offensive builds. The top three teams were obviously looking at like the Sableye kind of Charizard team, with the Quash Sunny Day shenanigans, and some other mons I thought were maybe would fit kind of well. Obviously, you have Tornadus and Zacian there as the restricted, and then some of these other things I thought, okay, well, maybe Tyranitar could help like the Evoltal matchup, and also obviously the ability to change weather is still quite powerful. So having 2 weather setters on the team were kind of there. And then, as you can see, I took a look at some of the other sort of archetypes that were becoming popular. So we have things like the sort of Sun Trick Room modes there with Calyrex, Ice Rider, the Lapdog builds that I think that were becoming quite popular. And like I said, I wasn't able to really find a groove with any of them, because sort of this hyper offense immediately going on the sort of offensive isn't really my play style. I wasn't finding success with it. I think, at least for me, when I try to play hyper offense, I don't ever go sort of the optimal moves. I always think to myself, what's just gonna kill everything on the opponent's team and go with the biggest damage? And that sort of leads me to playing more off the cuff and not really thinking out my moves, right, either that turn or the turn ahead. And so I started, I would say, trying to transition to things that were a little bit bulkier. So as you can see, right, still have a couple of those Lapdog builds there, which were a good mix between sort of hyper offense and then providing some bulk for your team. And eventually I just kind of got down to what I thought was a really interesting build. And of course, that was sort of the Grimmsnarl screens with Zacian and Thundurus. I thought that those 3 in particular made a really good core. And we can talk a little bit about like the Zacian later on, but I thought Grimmsnarl, I mean, has been one of my favorite Pokemon to use, I think, since Sword and Shield came out. I think it's probably one of the best support Pokemon that we've ever seen. There's such versatility with the sets that you can go for. So usually my teams have Grimmsnarl on it, and I thought, is it really going to be good for Series 8? And of course, as we've seen, still pretty high in usage. And so I ended up going with that. And then before I reached sort of my final build, as you can see, I had that Amoonguss on there, which was sort of a turbo Amoonguss, right, that you could just plop next to Thundurus, and if the team was slower, right, the opponent's team was slower, and you could get a couple of speed boosts up, there's not much you can do to have your, to stop your entire team from getting spored. But I actually found that I wasn't really bringing it that much, and it also didn't help what I thought was my weakest matchup, which was sort of Sun teams. And so I ended up settling on, as you can see, the final build for my team, which included that Rotom Heat with safety goggles. And I think that Rotom Heat, some people don't like it, but I find it to be really consistent against Sun. And it's just one of those Pokemon that I think that can be surprisingly bulky and really help out in sort of those poorer matchups. So that's sort of where I ended up eventually with this, 3 core of Thundurus and Grimmsnarl and Zacian, which I thought were good. And then, as you can see, the rest of the team.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really impressive that you managed to find so much success early on. I think I've always personally found that restricted formats are very difficult to adjust to. And my first time playing restricted format, it took me a long time to get comfortable with it. But it really looks like just like practicing with all these different teams and getting comfortable eventually with a lot of different types of play styles eventually let you find this like what really worked for you. And yeah, like I like a lot of the different elements in the team. I do think that like Rotom is a really cool Pokemon to tack on to beat Sun. Of course, I am also a huge fan of Grimmsnarl, and so yeah, I'm a big fan of how the team is constructed and a lot of the adjustments that you made over the course of this team building process. Do you want to talk about some of the individual Pokemon and why they're trained the way they are?
Yeah, so we'll start with Grimmsnarl, which I think is sort of the center of the team, and it's the one that I pretty much brought to every single matchup. As I said, I really think it's one of the best support Pokemon that we have in the format right now. And of course, dual screens will always be valuable, I think, especially in a meta with restricted, and especially in a meta that sort of leans more towards these offensive modes. I think having screens and getting screens up can really do a lot for your team's sort of survivability and ability to react to what your opponent's doing. So I sort of started out with this basic dual screens build, right? Of course, Reflect, Light, Screen are the 2 moves that are always going to be on there, along with Spirit Break, which of course is really, really useful Even if you're not hitting for super effective or neutral damage, if you're hitting into a special attacker and you can reliably give them a -1 to their special attack, it just further improves the bulk of your team. And so for Grimmsnarl, the last move was a little bit difficult for me to figure out because, of course, it has such an expansive sort of support move pool. So I was testing different things out. Half my team, as you can see, Gastrodon, Celesteecla, Rotom, Heat are special attackers, and so I thought maybe fake tears could help into certain matchups, but those Pokemon don't really have much, I would say, much sort of firepower in terms of that. So really, fake tears wasn't helping that much. I was still only 2-hit KOing most of the things that I was hitting fake tears into, and so it wasn't really that helpful. Overall, my team's still pretty slow, and so I thought maybe Scary Face could help out, especially against sort of that Zacian matchup or mirror. But again, it wasn't really helping, and I think that especially with a lot of these support moves, right? Sometimes you have to make a choice in a game. Are you going to put up screens, or are you going to hit them with your other support move like Taunt, Scary Face, Fake Tears? And for the most part, I was never really doing it. And so I think what a lot of us maybe saw in the in-game ladder, and it's sort of looking at the team reports and team sheets from a lot of the grassroots tournaments that have been happening, was Calyrex Shadow Rider was really, really popular, I would say, in the meta. And it kind of fell off around Players' Cup, which I was a little bit surprised about. But that's why I eventually ended up going with Darkest Lariat, and why I had sort of that attack investment into Grimmsnarl. Basically, even without attack investment, if you're just hitting a non-maxed Shadow Rider with Darkest Lariat, it's going to die. I mean, if you look at some of these support like Incineroar sets, which might run Snarl, like even a Snarl hitting 2 targets is still going to take like half of Calyrex's health away. And so I thought, okay, Darkest Lariat can help against that matchup. Right. And in particular, I think with these EVs, it might be a roll, but you should be able to get pretty much a one-hit KO onto Shadow Rider if it has Dynamaxed and hit you with a move right after Life Orb damage. If it's not Life Orb, then things get a little bit iffy, but pretty much that's what Darkest Lariat was there for. Before I had Sucker Punch, but of course a lot of these Shadow Riders kind of came paired with an NDD, and then you can't really touch it unless you max your Grimmsnarl, which I actually did, I believe, in one of my games. But I thought Darkest Lariat was pretty good. And of course, you also have in sort of a meta game where a lot of things might be running max Steel Spike to get defense boosts. I thought being able to have that consistent damage would be very good.
Right. People definitely forget that Grimmsnarl has a base 120 attack stat. It actually does a lot of damage. And even though it normally isn't a support role, the Dark and Fairy typing coverage is really, really strong in this metagame. And so, especially on your team where, Zacian, obviously very fast, wants to be the fastest thing on the field, doesn't outspeed Shadow Rider, so you might have trouble with that. You don't have anything else that resists Ghost. And so Grimmsnarl putting in work in that matchup, I think, is really important. And so you found a way for it to do that. And do you know what the defensive bulk on your Grimmsnarl does by any chance?
Yeah, so I thought, looking at my team, one of the weaker matchups was sort of Groudon Sun, and I think obviously you know that team quite well, and so I wanted to make sure this was sort of as bulky as it could be against that. So after a Reflect, I believe even like a +2 Precipice Blades, or even a +2 Max Quake shouldn't kill Grimmsnarl. So just being able to get those additional screens up are great. And it also gives a little bit more bulk towards, I would say, like the Thunderous Zacian matchups, which we've seen. Of course, there's no amount of EVs that are going to save a Grimmsnarl from Behemoth Blade, even behind screens. But sort of these other offensive physical mons that we've seen, like Thunderous, Landorus, Calyrex, Ice Rider, the defensive EVs were quite important, and so I EV'd it to basically survive most of the things from sort of a boosted, maybe like a +1 Thunderous, right, a +2 Groudon behind Reflect, so I could get up another screen, or even right hit their partner with another move and just get some chip damage on there. And then the rest I just put into special defense, just to make it a little bit bulkier on the special side. And again, I think unless it's, for example, like a Life Orb Regieleki, which I don't know if I saw any during the tournament, it's going to be at least a 2-hit KO or a 3-hit KO, depending on what move they're using behind Light Screen. So basically, I just always wanted to make sure that at the very least I could get both of my screens up during the match. I thought that was really important, and obviously that's sort of what Grimmsnarl is primarily on the team for. And so just making sure that what I sort of identified as a lot of these offensive threats, which aren't going to hit Grimmsnarl for super effective damage, I wanted to make sure that they were 2-hit KOs, maybe even after a boost.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And can you tell us about some of the Pokemon that Grimmsnarl is supporting?
Yeah, so actually, what I found was my most common lead into many of my games was Grimmsnarl Zacian. And I went into this thinking that, okay, I'm always pretty much going to be leading like Thunderous Zacian or Grimmsnarl Thunderous, right? I thought that would be the case. But then what I really found out is that, pretty much 4 out of the 6 Pokemon on my team are good Dynamax candidates. And so that's where I sort of went back to that reactive play style. But pretty much my opening game plan for most of the games that I played was Grimmsnarl Zacian. So if we look at Zacian, right, it's a little bit on the bulkier side. I still ended up going for pretty much almost max attack in Adamant Nature, because Zacian's just disgustingly powerful. It's busted if we're being honest, right? Behemoth Blade at +1 is going to chunk so much of the metagame, and even right if they switch in an Incineroar, Sacred Sword's still there and still going to take like 50% off of like instance health and get rid of its berry almost immediately. And so Zacian was really sort of my lead, and this was a little bit, I think, more of the standard Zacian set that we saw, which was Substitute and Protect. And I especially found those really valuable because obviously it's still usually quite fast, right? And so being able to sort of substitute just in front of a Dynamax Pokemon means that oftentimes they have to double target your Zacian to get it off the field, right? If they really don't want to face it. And so I usually brought that out first with Grimmsnarl because behind screens, it's just really, really bulky. And not much is one-hit KOing it behind screens. So that's usually what I brought out first. And we can talk a little bit about specific matchups in the metagame after, but that was sort of my game plan for most of these, because really it's quite easy just to turn one, right? Either protect or substitute, get up a screen, right? And then get up your second screen and just start chunking into things with Zacian. And again, Grimmsnarl with some offensive investment can hit, quite hard off that high sort of attack stat. And again, if you're going to be getting Zacian off the field, you're going to have to double target it. And so I found it really, really helpful to be next to Grimmsnarl, because people will often, look at Grimmsnarl, kind of ignore it, right? It can be left to later unless they really don't want screens up for whatever reason. And so I found that those two were a really, really strong lead, and often what I went with, especially.
Yeah, and like you said, you want to play a little bit more of a defensive game. And I think that something like Zacian is the best possible punish to aggressive teams a lot of times, because if they Dynamax and they don't KO the Zacian, you are probably KOing them back. And with Grimmsnarl, of course, it's going to be really difficult for them to KO the Zacian. If they do try to KO the Zacian, Substitute is a great punish for that. And so the combination of Grimmsnarl and Zacian is really cool because of the way that it can slow down the game and really let you play your preferred playstyle.
Yeah, exactly. And looking at Zacian itself, as you can see, it's adamant with very little speed investment. And that's because, again, I was sort of anticipating, especially on the in-game ladder, before I was really leading Thunderous and Zacian sort of before the main tournament itself. And so those sort of speed EVs on Zacian are so it underspeeds the Thunderous, because I thought it was really valuable, right, to potentially get off just Dynamax Thunderous, get off a max Knuckle, and then start hitting things with +2 Zacian, because unless you're sending out like a Ferrothorn, or again, if you switch into like an Incineroar and Behemoth Blade, those are some things that might be able to take it. But pretty much, right? If you're hitting things with a +2 Zacian, it's gonna faint. So I thought that having those sort of speed IVs, or sort of speed EVs next to Thundurus, were really helpful. And then everything else, I thought, just, put it into a little bit of bulk. I thought its physical, its physical and special bulk are both pretty good, but with a little bit of special EVs in the health, it will at least, I think, survive Charizard, Gmax Wildfire outside of the sun. It will survive behind light screens. It takes maybe, I want to say, I think when I calculated it, about 60 to 65% based on if it was a timid Charizard or a modest Charizard at full special attack EVs. And so I thought that was kind of helpful, right? If my opponent didn't position themselves, for example, Charizard in the sun, take, +1 Behemoth Blade off of Adamant, you're still outspeeding Charizard, and you're still taking, I think, around 80% of its health. And so I thought that was sort of useful for the people who are going to lead Charizard into this team, because this team does have a little bit of a problem with fire sometimes for the mons that are really important. And so that's sort of what those special defense EVs and health EVs are there for.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so can you talk me through some of the other Pokemon on the team?
Yeah, absolutely. So then if we look, I think sort of the next big addition that I liked was sort of Celesteecla, right? I thought Celesteecla is still a really good Pokemon. I think it sort of fell off a little bit in usage again because Sun was becoming popular once again with, I think, Weather Ball, right? Weather Ball, Venusaur, and Charizard, of course. But what I was having a lot of problems with in sort of testing this team was the sort of Metagross and Necrozma Duskmane and Solgaleo matchups. They were really, really hard for this team to get through originally, because a lot of them, for example, right, Metagross and Solgaleo started carrying Rock Slide to hit sort of Thundurus and to hit fire types that might chunk them for super effective damage. And so you can't just bring Rotom Heat into that matchup and hope that things are going to be fine. And also, right, of course, Calyrex Ice, another Pokemon that's just disgustingly powerful and will still chunk a lot of this team for like 50%, even behind Reflect. And so Celesteecla is there, obviously sort of as a support set. But it's really there as sort of the Dynamax target. If my opponent has a lot of Pokemon that are going to be hitting for physical damage, I will pretty much always bring Celesteecla in the back. Right, hopefully I'm two turns into the opponent's Dynamax, or even 3 turns into the opponent's Dynamax. I'll Dynamax Celesteecla and I'll start getting defense boosts on it next to its partner, which was usually Gastrodon. And so once you get those 2 Pokemon onto the field with defense boosts, there's not much your opponent can do, right, if they're sort of physically oriented. And so I thought that Celesteecla was a really valuable component of this team. It's a pretty standard set, right? Of course, Flash Cannon for Max Steel Spike, Flamethrower to hit things that are also Steel types, like potentially other Celesteecla, which I didn't run into, or things like Kartana, which a lot of people were carrying on sort of these Tornogre teams. But looking at these sort of EV spreads, right? It's a calm nature. Pretty much I wanted to make sure that I could boost on both ends. So if Celesteecla did end up getting a kill, I would end up getting a special defense boost. And that is really, really valuable because, of course, if your end game is towards Celesteecla, Leech Seed, right, sort of outliving the opponent, having boosts on both sides are really valuable. So even after, after one special defense boost, behind screens, I mean, you're still taking maybe like 30 to 40% from like a Regieleki Thunderbolt. But if you are able to get like something like 2 special defense boosts, even outside of screens, unless it's like a choice specs, like modest Regieleki, you're not too hit KOing it with Thunderbolt. And so I found that really, really helpful, I think, sort of towards the end game. But Celesteecla is really there not to provide offense, but to sort of be my defensive Dynamax option. And that was really, really helpful. And I actually did play. At one point before top 16, I was playing a Calyrex Ice team. And Celesteecla was really, really helpful there, right? Because of course, Calyrex Ice is still very powerful. But if you can deny that Calyrex, right, any boosts from KOing your Pokemon, and in turn get these Steel Spike defense boosts up, it's still not going to kill your team. And so I think that end game for me was Celesteecla, Gastrodon at 3 defense boosts. And at that point, there was nothing really that my opponent could do. And so Celesteecla was really helpful, not as sort of an offensive Dynamax option, but really there to be a defensive option and make sure that in the end game, right, your last 2 Pokemon are incredibly hard to take down from the physical side.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know that Celesteecla was something that Eddie was using at the very beginning of the format. And then I think even he stopped using it. It kind of fell off. But a lot of the things that you said it was there to respond to ended up doing really well. We saw, Calyrex Ice did really well. We saw things like Metagross. Obviously, Metagross isn't a Solgaleo or a Dialga, but it plays in a lot of the same ways despite not being restricted. And so Metagross did really well in this tournament. And so Celesteecla responds to a lot of the things that might have been under the radar. And in that case, you might have been like one step ahead of the metagame there.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, right, a lot of people sort of trended with those, especially I think the team that we saw, like the sort of Kyogre, Metagross compositions, right, an end game of Celesteecla and Gastrodon, if you can take out whatever grass type they have on their team, right, because a lot of them are running Rillaboom or sort of Kartana. Once you get defense boosts on it, right, even Metagross, if it has its weakness policy activated, isn't doing much, and Kyogre can't touch Gastrodon. And so that sort of end game was really, really valuable. And even I think if you look at this team in team preview, I think it's really, really good at sort of swaying opponents to the worst case scenario and maybe preparing for mons that you won't even bring into battle, right? Like, for example, if you're running a Kyogre team and you have a grass type, you pretty much always have to bring it, right? Because you see Gastrodon and there's not much that you can do about it. And so, right, with something like Thundurus, which with Assault Vest behind Light Screen isn't dying to Kyogre, I think you can sort of force your opponent with these kinds of team compositions to bring things that are ultimately not going to be very helpful, depending on what I choose to bring into the battle. And so I thought that Celesteecla and Gastrodon were really helpful with that, and I found that a lot of times my opponents would try to, they could see that maybe I would play towards that sort of end game and bring their Pokemon that might counter it, and then eventually, right, find out, oh, okay, I didn't bring it into the battle, and so they ended up bringing Pokemon that really weren't helpful for them. And so I thought that was sort of an added value of especially Celesteecla to this team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And then just like you were saying, Gastrodon's another Pokemon that people kind of stopped using. And then like the week before the tournament, I know a Gastrodon team won the Victory Road Tour, the Victory Road 5 qualifier. And then, of course, you used it to a lot of success here. And so it's kind of re-emerged into the metagame. Can you tell me a little bit more about the Gastrodon and why you brought it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, I think that, right, when I was sort of getting back into Series 8 after not having played at all, everything I kept seeing was like Tornogre, right? You'd go on to like VGC Twitter and it would be a lot of memes about Tornogre. And I was like, okay, so this is obviously something that I should be prepared for going into it. And so my mind naturally went to Gastrodon because actually I think during Series 7, I made it to #1 on the in-game ladder with a team that had Gastrodon on it. And it's always sort of been a favorite Pokemon of mine ever since it was released in Gen 4. And I was like, okay, so I think that I can see some success with this. So first of all, I think it's really good into Zacian, right? I think the way that my Gastrodon is EV'd is that a Zacian at +1 with Sacred Sword is activating its Citrus Berry, right? It might do, I think, something like 45 to 55%. And so I can always get that berry activated and then hit back with something like an Earth Power, which really chunks Zacian. Behind Reflect, it's taking 25 to 30% from a +1 Zacian. So a 4-hit KO, and at that point, Gastrodon can just 2-hit KO Zacian back with Earth Power. So that's sort of what those defensive investments and special attack investments were for. I specifically thought that Gastrodon was really good into Zacian. Before, actually, I tried to run sort of a Jellicent. I was testing out Jellicent before because I thought that nothing Zacian can really touch Jellicent, but it was just a little bit difficult to position. I think in a meta with Venusaur and Regieleki running around everywhere, and so Gastrodon really helped out against Zacian. Gastrodon obviously really helps out against Regieleki. I think none of the Regieleki I saw carried anything like Hyper Beam or the other weird offensive options there were. So if my opponent was, for example, afraid of Celesteecla in the end game and they brought Regieleki, well, there's Gastrodon, and now you have essentially one Pokemon that can't even touch it on your team. And so I thought that was really helpful. But of course, into Tornogre, right? It does really well. You're not touching it with Kyogre if it's next to Celesteela and it has defense boosts. There's not much that your Metagross is doing to it either, and especially behind screens, it's just so bulky. It's ridiculous. And this was another Pokemon that I actually found myself Dynamaxing a lot because I think it is another one of those great Pokemon that is very helpful as a defensive Dynamax, and with the special attack investment, it can do a lot of damage, right? So obviously setting up Rain for itself to power up Max Geyser or Scald and changing the weather, and also Earth Power there, Max Quake boosting your special defense. Again, it's really helpful, right? There are some games that I would Dynamax Gastrodon next to Celesteela if my opponent had primarily special attacking Pokemon, and then again, right behind something like 2 or 3 special defense boosts, they're both sort of unkillable. And so looking at sort of the moves and the item, I thought Citrus Berry, very helpful, right? In VGC, allows it to dodge a lot of these things that would be 2-hit KOs. And it's just really great for a defensive Pokemon. Before, when I was testing this team out, before I finalized it, I want to say maybe the day before I finalized the team, I was running like a Yawn, sort of a Yawn variant. So it was Scald, Earth Power, Protect, Yawn instead of Recover. But I really found that like it didn't help me that much. I think that this team in particular, for the most part, doesn't really care about your opponent's positioning, right? Like your opponent can have great positioning, but if your Pokemon are behind screens and have defense boosts, all the positioning in the world won't help you if you can't kill these Pokemon. And so I thought like Yawn didn't really help with phasing. It wasn't doing much for my team in terms of support. And of course, like maybe I just got awful RNG, but every single game it was like a one or 2 turn wake up, and then I would still lose anyways. And so I was like, the team's probably not great if I have to rely on 3 turn sleep to save me. And so that's why I ended up going with Recover in the end, because again, with those sort of defensive boosts behind screens, you're not killing Gastrodon anytime soon. And so I found that to be sort of the really helpful option to go for. And I think, it resisted a lot of the metagame. Like if you're up against sort of like the classic Thundurus, Zacian composition, once Thundurus's Dynamax ends, it can hit with super power, which will lower its attack, or it can try to spam fly into something that has Protect. And so I found that really, really valuable, I think, in the matchups when I was testing against other sort of Thundurus Zacian comps. It just was super helpful for sort of preventing them from steamrolling, to just max Gastrodon, get rid of their Zacian, and then their Thundurus really couldn't do much against Gastrodon. And of course, it's there. What I was able to do several times, I think, into sort of Tornogre teams is place it next to Rotom Heat, right? And then, of course, your opponent has to start making a decision. Do you start spamming Water Spout and Origin Pulse and giving Gastrodon special attack boosts, which, if you Dynamax it with a special attack boost, it's doing a significant amount of damage to your opponent's team. And so I found that really, really helpful and was able to get, Rotom and Gastrodon onto the field at the same time and sort of end up outmaneuvering a lot of these Tornogre teams that I was facing on the ladder.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the combination of Gastrodon screens, we were looking at the team that did well in Victory Road leading up to Players Cup, and we were like, wow, Grimmsnarl Gastrodon just bodies every single Kyogre team. They just cannot beat that. And so having that and then having it against Zacian teams, you just like it seems like it is really good into a lot of the metagame, and it's no surprise that it's picking up in usage. I think we're going to see a lot more of it. Yeah, and then recover also. Like I like that. I think that a lot of Zacian teams are very reliant on Zacian to win end games because once the Dynamaxes are burned, it's that's really the only damage dealer. But on your team now with Celesteecla and with Gastrodon, to some extent Rotom Heat as well, you've got a bunch of different Pokemon that if you take the right KOs, they can win the game on their own, and that's really valuable on a team like this.
Right, exactly, and I think that's the great thing. There are some matchups where people won't bring in their restricteds, but pretty much 99% of the time, if your opponent has a Zacian, they're bringing it because it's just so powerful, even into things that it's not, that resist it. And so yeah, something like Gastrodon, especially, which can just 2-hit KO. Most Zacian builds are really, really valuable. And again, you're not 2-hit KOing a Gastrodon with a Citrus Berry behind screens. It's just not happening. And so that was really helpful, as you said, for things like Zacian. And then the last one here we have is Rotom Heat, right? And of course, I said this was sort of like the last addition to the team that I thought was really really helpful. And it was primarily for my Sun matchup. So as you can see, not really a lot of special attack investment, even though it is a modest nature. But when you have something like Nasty Plot, like you're still going to 1-hit KO or at least 2-hit KO most of the metagame after a boost, even if you're not Dynamaxed. What I really, again, was having trouble with was a lot of these Groudon Sun teams. And so I was like, okay, I think it might be valuable to have Rotom have a lot of defensive investment and sort of this, a lot of health investment to make sure that I can do well into sort of that Groudon matchup. Because a lot of the time, right, if you're running Groudon Sun, Rotom, it's not dying to Charizard, it's not dying to Venusaur, and so you're going to have to rely on that Groudon to get rid of it. So with these sort of EV investments, it's taking unboosted Rock Slide or unboosted Max Rockfall behind Reflect, even to like a non-Dynamaxed Rotom, is only doing something like 30 to 35% with these defensive investments, and so it's really, really valuable for avoiding sort of those kills from Groudon. Dynamaxed, obviously, it takes even less damage, and depending on how the Groudon is EV trained, is usually going to kill with 2 max flares. And so that was really, I think, helpful into sort of when I was team testing that Groudon Sun matchup. And so that's primarily what that was for. The other EVs, I had there for speed. People weren't really running it, but I wanted to at least be able to outrun Turbo Lapras outside of something like Tailwinds. I know that it used to be very popular. It kind of fell off, I think, with these new Lapdog comps, but I still wanted it to at least outspeed sort of those Pokemon, or at least outspeed Incineroar that had some kind of speed investment, so I wasn't getting snarled or parting shotted before I could get an attack off or something like that. And then the rest just went into special defense, which I don't really know how helpful those EVs were. I'm sure that this Rotom set could be optimized a little bit more, but overall it was really, really helpful. I think, especially because I was just lacking a really good Sun matchup before, and also Amoonguss gave my team trouble, and so having Rotom there was really, really helpful.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know that when I was team building a little earlier in the format, and I had an extra, I actually went through the thought process. If I could have any one Pokemon in the game, non-restricted Pokemon against Sun, what Pokemon would I put on the team? And I came to the conclusion similarly, like Rotom Heat with safety goggles is really the pick. Yeah. Just is so good into that one matchup. And it has some utility in other matchups. It's pretty good against Ice Rider, for example, because it kind of resists all of its attacks. But it's in the Sun is so common, around the world in Players Cup. And so for you to be able to beat Sun, or at least have a slightly better matchup against Sun with one Pokemon, definitely warrants a spot on the team.
Yeah, exactly. And so it really was I think one of my most brought Pokemon. It was just so helpful.
Yeah. And so, can you talk me through how you approach some of the common matchups that you might face in the metagame right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the ones that sort of always gives me trouble, I always have trouble with, was Trick Room. And so for Trick Room, I would pretty much always lead Grimmsnarl Zacian. And pretty much, right, because the goal of Trick Room teams 100% of the time is to get Trick Room up and then get their sweeper in so they can just start killing everything on your team. And so with Grimmsnarlization, right, I would usually go Grimmsnarlization with Gastrodon, Celesteecla in the back because both of them are relatively slow and very bulky. And so I would pretty much always get the corresponding screen up, right? A lot of the times it was Calyrex Ice Rider, so it would be Reflect up, and the first turn I would always just hit Substitute on Cessation because a lot of these leads, right, are just so non-offensive. It would be something like NDD or right NDD Mimikyu, NDD. I guess you can do like NDD Ice Rider, but pretty much you get a substitute up and it stays there for several turns, right? And that was really, really useful for stalling out turns of Trick Room. And even with the sort of attack investment, right? Grimmsnarl, it's something like a 2-hit KO onto most NDD. And so it was really helpful for stalling out those Trick Room turns and basically saying like, okay, you can set up Trick Room. I'm going to sit here behind my substitute and my screens. I'm not going to really try to take any KOs right now, and I'll let you waste Trick Room turns, and then have right Zacian be there on the field when it ends to take down whatever you have in the back. And so that was really helpful. And of course, Celesteecla, Gastrodon in the back again. A lot of these Trick Room teams are Calyrex, sort of like these Calyrex Ice Rider teams. And so always bring Celesteecla in the back. Hopefully their Dynamax is over. You hit Protect with Gastrodon, you max Steel Spike, and you just start getting those defense boosts, so they become unkillable. And that was pretty much the game plan with something like Trick Room. For things like Sun, it really depends. Actually, I was, I think the team that you built, that sort of Sun team was something I was not expecting, and I think it was quite clever because in my mind I was like, okay, I think a lot of Sun teams are only going to run Groudon and one of Venusaur Charizard. In my mind, I was like Venusaur and Charizard on a Groudon Sun team. It seems like a little bit greedy, so I was like, I'm not too worried about that. But for those, specifically for the Sun matchup where it's only Charizard or Venusaur, I would always pretty much lead Grimmsnarl, Rotom, right? Because there's not a lot that they can do into that lead. A lot of times that would force them right to Dynamax Groudon. And then I could switch out into something like Gastrodon, which is taking like a negative damage from a max Rocks Fall, like behind Reflect. And so I could usually play around that kind of Dynamax and sort of end up positioning myself where in the end game it's Rotom Heat versus their Sunmons, and they're just not touching Rotom Heat. And so pretty much for Sun, yeah, I would always bring something. It would be like Grimmsnarl, Rotom, Zacian, and if they went Charizard Sun, it would be Gastrodon in the back, because even with solar power, right? Air Slash is not doing as much damage as they want into Gastrodon, and so it can be quite helpful. And there were some Sun matchups when I was testing this team where I could just actually Dynamax Gastrodon instead if they didn't have Venusaur, and right, get rid of their Sun. 2-hit KO Groudon, right? 2-hit KO Charizard, because most of them are not carrying Solar Beam anymore, right? And so that was pretty much the game plan for that. And then of course you have Zacian in the back to sort of take those KOs that they need. The other things that we sort of saw and I talked about before was looking at right, things like Metagross or Solgaleo, those kinds of teams. Again, the core four of this team, if your opponent doesn't have Sun, would be, lead Grimmsnarl, Zacian, Gastrodon, Celesteecla, right? Again, either get Reflect Up always on the first turn, hit Substitute or Protect, right? Waste. Because usually I think a lot of these players who are sort of piloting Solgaleo or Metagross would pretty much always go for the Weakness Policy activation first turn, try to kill Zacian. So obviously, if you just hit Substitute on the first turn, they've wasted a turn of Dynamax. You hit Protect again, and if they decided to target Zacian again, that's another turn of Dynamax down. And so that was really the game plan against those. And then, of course, in the back with Celesteecla, Gastrodon, once their Dynamax is over, even at +2, they're not doing much damage once you get Steel Spike boosts up. And so that was the end game that I would always play towards because it was just so helpful to prevent the opponent from taking KOs. Some other things, like I said, I tried for this team. I thought Calyrex Ghost would be a little bit more prominent, and so if they did have a Calyrex Ghost team, I would lead something like Grimmsnarl, Thundurus, and then have Zacian and Gastrodon in the back. Even if I don't Dynamax Thundurus, right? Foul play for the most part should take a sizable chunk out of Calyrex Ghost Rider, and it should always survive. It should always survive a Astral Barrage or Max Ghost with Assault Vest behind Light Screen. And so that was pretty much the game plan for that. Of course, I could max Thundurus if I wanted. But for those teams, sometimes I did play towards the end game of get Gastrodon on the field next to Zacian, and then hit Protect with Zacian, Dynamax Gastrodon, get special defense boosts, and become really hard to kill again from sort of that special defense side if they have Calyrex Ghost. So that was the game plan there. Besides that, I think, again, maybe the biggest archetype was Tornogre, and I would always, with Tornogre, I would always lead Grimmsnarl, Zacian, and then have Gastrodon and one of Celesteecla or Rotom Heat in the back, depending on what they had. And so those, for the most part, those end games are pretty easy because I think a lot of those teams, again, nowadays might have Metagross or will have Regieleki there as well. And so again, it just bodies Tornogre. Like, what are you going to do against Gastrodon? Especially if you if they have like a Kartana or Rillaboom, which are becoming more common on those teams. If you get rid of those right early enough into the game, then what are they going to do? And especially those situations, I would most likely have Celesteecla in the back and then actually Dynamax Celesteecla and change the weather into Sun. Right, or give defense boosts to sort of my other Pokemon that were there, and that was really helpful. But those are most of the archetypes I think that we sort of saw. The one archetype that I couldn't get past, and I think maybe other people were with me on this, that I kind of disrespected as a meme, was Colossal. Again, everyone's like, "Oh, Colossal's going to win a third Players Cup," and I was like, "There's no way." I knew some people were piloting Colossal teams, like Joe, and I was just like, okay, well, the bracket is so many people. I'm not going to play Joe, whatever. Yeah, this team does nothing into Colossal, especially if Colossal has Solar Beam, because Gastrodon is literally the one answer that I have for Colossal. And so if I couldn't preserve the Gastrodon and outlast their Dynamax and outlast like their Sun set up by Max Flare, it was pretty much just an auto loss. And so for that archetype, I pretty much if I had run into those, I would have had to take the L on the chin. And so that's quite difficult, and maybe should have respected that a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Those matchups make a lot of sense. And of course, Colossal is, part of why it came into prominence once again is because of how good it is into teams that have Thundurus and Zacian on them. Yeah. And I think by making your team so strong against all the other teams, by using this particular composition of 6 Pokemon, you did leave the Colossal potentially unchecked. Again, Solar Beam, I don't know if that was standard, but I know that a couple of Colossal players who did well in this tournament did use it. And so, of course, Gastrodon, not the most helpful there. But yeah, like the matchups made a lot of sense. And obviously you found a lot of success by knowing your matchups and knowing how to play against them. Can you tell me about 1 or 2 matches that really stood out to you in your Players' Cup run?
Yeah, I wish I had recorded them sort of in the beginning, so I could get a little bit more specific. But I think, as I said, there was one match I want to say it was into a Groudon Sun team sort of earlier on that I ended up Dynamaxing Grimmsnarl. I think for whatever reason I was just like, maybe this is going to be the helpful option here. And I ended up Dynamaxing Grimmsnarl, and it did end up being very helpful. I think they had light. I think they had light screen up, and so I Dynamaxed the Grimmsnarl, used Max Darkness onto their Groudon, and then secured the KO with a +2 overheat from Rotom, which I don't think would have killed if I didn't get that special defense drop. And so that was quite amusing to me. There is also another team that was very interesting. I believe it had Choice Scarf, Calyrex, Ice Rider. And that one was really hard to play around because they had, for their fourth coverage move, they had Seed Bomb. And so, like I said, for a lot of the times for like these Calyrex Ice Rider teams, my end game would be Gastrodon, Celesteecla. And so that one was a little bit difficult to maneuver. It was just really entertaining trying to sort of figure out, okay, how do I get around this? Because I want to bring Gastrodon in, but it's just going to die to a maxed grass attack. And so I sort of had to play really defensively, I think, with the Celesteela getting the boosts up, and then wait for its Dynamax to be over, sort of lock into I think Glacial Lance is what they eventually locked into both games, and sort of secured it with that. But that was good. And then maybe one other. There was one where the RNG really loved me for some reason, and I think we were both down to our last Pokemon. I think they had a Lilligant which had a Focus Sash on it, and I was down to my Rotom which had something like 13 health left outside of Dynamax. And for whatever reason, my opponent decided to go for Leaf Storm, and their Leaf Storm missed. And so luckily, I didn't have to bring that to a game 3. I felt pretty comfortable because it was a Sun matchup, but I was happy sort of to eke by with the RNG gods blessing me that day.
Yeah, definitely. We take those for sure. And yeah, that's really cool. It seems like you faced a lot of pretty crazy teams about the run, or at least a lot of interesting takes on maybe more meta teams like Lilligant. But yeah, that's really cool. Of course, we have the rental code on screen, and we have the paste in the description down below if you want to try this team. It is a very unique take on the Thunderous Zacian type of archetype that's been developing pretty recently. So it'd be great if you tried it out. Ethan, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any final words or shout-outs that you want to give?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I think it's great. I love a lot of your content, and so it's really nice to be able to sort of contribute to that. But I will say the one person I will shout out with is Battle Room Colin. He was the one who actually gave me the idea, I think, to replace Amogus with that sort of Rotom with the safety goggles, and that was supremely helpful. I don't think I would have qualified without that. So thanks a lot to him. And yeah, besides that, thanks for having me. And I think now, especially after being able to sort of qualify, I'm definitely looking into getting more into the grassroots scenes. And of course, I'll be in the next Player Cup. So hopefully we'll be connecting again for one of these team reports, or you'll be seeing me on stream in top 4. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely looking forward to it. And again, so thank you again for coming on. And until next time, I will see you all later.